Most people remember Robin Williams as the man who could make an entire room erupt into laughter before anyone realized he had quietly slipped a lesson about kindness into the moment. On screen, he moved like electricity, fast, unpredictable, joyful. But behind the camera, in the long hours between action and cut, there was another side of him that only the crew, the assistants, and the people at the very bottom of the call sheet ever really saw. Hollywood sets are often imagined as magical places, spaces where creativity flows freely and everyone is chasing art. The truth is more complicated. A major film set is closer to a carefully timed machine than a playground. Every department moves with precision. Lighting, camera, wardrobe, sound, makeup, continuity, production, each one is a gear, and if even one slips, the entire mechanism grinds to a halt. Minutes turn into thousands of dollars. Delays ripple outward like shockwaves. During the production of Mrs. Doubtfire, the days were long even by industry standards. The film required complex makeup, tight comedic timing, and scenes that depended on exact choreography. Robin Williams would arrive long before sunrise, sitting patiently while artists transformed him layer by layer into the elderly Scottish nanny the world would soon fall in love with. The process was slow, delicate, and physically exhausting. Adhesives pulled at skin, prosthetics trapped heat, costumes added weight. Yet despite the discomfort, he was known for keeping the energy alive. Between takes, he would drift across departments, cracking jokes with the grips, asking the camera assistants about their families, thanking the makeup team by name. He treated the set less like a hierarchy and more like a shared mission. That atmosphere mattered because pressure was everywhere. Studios watched budgets closely. Schedules were tight. Expectations were high. The film's tone balanced heartfelt emotion with physical comedy, something notoriously difficult to capture on camera without dozens of takes. Some scenes required perfect timing from multiple actors, background performers, and technical operators all at once. On one particular afternoon, deep into a long shooting day, the crew had already been resetting the same sequence repeatedly. Lights were hot. Conversations were quieter than usual. Even the usual between-take laughter had faded into tired smiles. Among the dozens of background performers was a young extra new to professional sets, still learning the rhythm of marks, cues, and silent reactions. For someone stepping onto a major production for the first time, everything felt overwhelming. The equipment, the pace, the unspoken rules. Extras are expected to blend into the environment, to create realism without drawing attention. It sounds simple, but it requires precision. The young man had spent the morning watching Robin work. What struck him wasn't just the performance. It was the ease with which Robin shifted from humor to focus. One moment he was making a sound technician laugh, the next he was fully present in character. To someone new, it looked effortless. It never is. As the crew prepared for another take, instructions were repeated, positions adjusted, background movement timed to the main action. Everyone waited for the quiet signal that filming was about to resume. Rolling. The familiar words settled over the set like a held breath. The scene began smoothly, dialogue landed, movement flowed, background performers followed their cues. Then something small happened, so small most audiences would never notice if it stayed in the final cut. A mistimed motion, a slight hesitation, the kind of human error that happens when fatigue and pressure intersect. The director called for a reset. No anger, just efficiency. Again, another attempt. Another minor issue. Time stretched. Fatigue deepened. By the next take, tension had begun to creep into the edges of conversations. Crew members spoke more quietly. Movements became sharper. When schedules slip, even calm professionals can feel the weight of responsibility pressing down. The young extra felt it most of all. He wasn't trying to stand out, only trying not to make another mistake. But that fear made every cue feel heavier. Every second before action felt longer. The more he focused on doing everything perfectly, the less natural his movements became. It's a paradox many beginners face. The harder you try not to mess up, the more your body forgets how to move naturally. Another take. Another reset. The director stepped away from the monitor for a moment, clearly frustrated. Not at any single person, but at the accumulating delays that were eating away at the day's schedule. No one said anything out loud, but the atmosphere had changed. The set felt tighter, quieter, like everyone was bracing against invisible pressure. The young extra noticed the shift immediately. His hands felt colder. His timing, usually simple, now felt like a test he could fail in front of 100 professionals. Nearby, Robin Williams sat between setups, still in full costume, observing the room the way he often did, quietly, attentively. He had a habit of watching people when tension rose, reading body language the way a comedian reads an audience. Another reset was called. The young extra missed a cue by a fraction of a second. This time, the frustration in the room didn't stay hidden. Voices weren't raised dramatically, but the tone sharpened enough that everyone felt it. The kind of moment where embarrassment can hit harder than any shouted criticism. The young man froze in his chair, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. Around him, people avoided eye contact, not out of cruelty, but because film sets move fast. When something goes wrong, the instinct is to fix it quickly and move on. Except this time, something unusual happened. Before the next instruction could be given, Robin Williams slowly stood up. Not dramatically, not angrily. Just deliberately. Even through the heavy costume and layers of makeup, his movement carried a quiet authority. Conversations faded. Crew members paused mid-adjustment. When someone known for keeping the peace changes posture, people notice. He didn't address the entire room. He simply walked toward the center of the set, calm, composed, and fully present. For a moment, the production machine, normally relentless, seemed to hesitate. It was only a few seconds. But on a professional set, a few seconds of unexpected stillness feels like time stretching. Robin looked around, not accusingly, not confrontationally, just observing. His expression held something gentler than frustration, something closer to concern. The young extra, still frozen with embarrassment, suddenly realized the attention in the room had shifted away from his mistake. Not erased, just softened. Robin spoke quietly, so quietly that only those closest could hear the exact words, but the tone carried across the silence. It wasn't about blame. It wasn't about delays. It was about remembering that everyone in the room was human before they were roles on a call sheet. The effect was immediate. Shoulders relaxed. Breaths released. The tension that had been building all afternoon didn't vanish, but it loosened enough for the room to feel workable again. The director nodded, taking a step back toward the monitor. A short break was called. No speeches, no grand gestures. Just a pause. And sometimes, on a high-pressure set, a pause is the most powerful reset there is. Robin then did something even smaller, something that would never appear in any official behind-the-scenes footage. He walked over to the table where the young extra sat, pulled up a chair, and sat down across from him, still dressed as Mrs. Doubtfire, glasses and all. Up close, the young man could see the details of the makeup, the seams, the texture, the effort it took to become someone else for the sake of a story. Robin smiled, not the big performance smile audiences knew, but a softer one. The kind meant for a single person, not a crowd. He asked a simple question. First big set. The young extra nodded, unable to find words. Robin leaned back slightly, as if sharing a secret instead of giving advice. He spoke about how every actor, no matter how experienced, misses marks, forgets timing, or freezes under pressure. He joked about the number of times he himself had needed another take that very day. It wasn't a lecture. It was reassurance. Around them, crew members pretended to stay busy, but many were listening. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was kind. In an industry built on schedules and efficiency, kindness stands out more than any spotlight. After a minute, Robin gave the young man one clear, simple direction. Don't try to be perfect, just be natural. The break ended. Positions reset. The room felt different now, not silent with tension, but focused with intention. When the next take rolled, the young extra moved without overthinking. The motion landed naturally. The scene flowed. Cut. This time, the director's voice carried relief instead of strain. They had it. The machine moved forward again. But something subtle had changed, not in the script, not in the camera angle, but in the way people looked at each other. Because for a brief moment, someone had reminded an entire production that behind every role, star, crew, or extra, was a person trying their best. And sometimes, That reminder is enough to change the rest of the day. The strange thing about tension on a film set is that it never truly disappears. It only changes shape. After that quiet pause and reset, the production moved forward as if nothing unusual had happened. Cameras rolled, marks were hit, dialogue landed. To an outsider, the day looked normal again. But to the people who had been standing there when the atmosphere cracked, something had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. The young extra felt it most. When the next sequence began, he noticed the way a script supervisor gave him a small, almost invisible nod before action. One of the grips, a man who had barely spoken all week, adjusted a chair so the extra had more space to move naturally. Even the assistant director, usually focused purely on logistics, softened his tone when calling background cues. None of it was dramatic. No one made a speech. But the invisible hierarchy that usually defined a set had for a moment loosened. And at the center of that shift was Robin Williams, who had already slipped back into character as if the interruption had never happened. From the outside, he looked exactly the same, posture slightly hunched under the costume padding, voice transformed into the warm, accented cadence of Mrs. Doubtfire. But those close enough could see something else, a sharper awareness in his eyes, the kind of attention that doesn't come from performance but from empathy. He was still tracking the room, still reading the emotional temperature of everyone around him. The next few takes went smoothly, but smooth doesn't mean easy. Comedy is one of the hardest things to capture on film because timing isn't just about the main actor. It's about everyone in the frame moving like parts of a single organism. A half-second too early, and the joke collapses. A hesitation, and the rhythm breaks. The restaurant set they were shooting in required dozens of people to breathe in sync without appearing choreographed. By late afternoon, fatigue returned like a slow tide. Makeup adhesive had begun to irritate Robin's skin beneath the prosthetics. The stage lights turned the set into a pocket of trapped heat. Crew members rotated water bottles between setups, trying to stay focused as the hours stretched past what anyone's body considered comfortable. It was during one of these resets that the young extra overheard something that tightened his chest again. Two production staff members were quietly discussing the schedule, how the day was already behind, how another delay might push the shoot into overtime, how the studio was watching every added expense. The words weren't harsh, but the implication was clear. Mistakes had consequences far beyond embarrassment. For someone new, that knowledge felt crushing. He began second-guessing every movement again. Every cue felt like a test he could fail publicly. The earlier reassurance from Robin still lingered, but anxiety is stubborn. It doesn't vanish just because someone is kind to you once. As the crew prepared for another complex pass of the scene, the assistant director called for quiet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The familiar rhythm of preparation returned. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of immediately taking his mark, Robin remained seated for a second longer than usual. Not enough to disrupt the schedule, but long enough to look across the set, scanning faces the way a teacher scans a classroom before beginning a lesson. His gaze paused, just briefly, on the young extra. Not intense, not obvious. Just enough to say, "You're still okay." Then he rose and moved into position. That tiny moment carried more weight than any loud reassurance. It wasn't about fixing the earlier mistake anymore. It was about preventing the fear from returning. The cameras rolled. The scene unfolded with careful precision, dialogue weaving through background movement, servers crossing frame, glasses clinking softly. Robin delivered lines with effortless warmth, improvising subtle inflections that made the moment feel alive without disrupting the timing. Halfway through the take, a small technical issue occurred, a prop placed slightly off mark. Normally, that kind of thing would trigger an immediate reset. But this time, something different happened. Robin adjusted in character, without breaking rhythm, turning the unexpected detail into a natural piece of the scene. His reaction fit so seamlessly that most viewers would never guess it hadn't been planned. The moment passed, invisible to anyone who wasn't watching the monitors closely. When the director called cut, there was a brief silence. Then a quiet ripple of appreciation moved through the crew. Not loud applause, just the subtle acknowledgement professionals give when someone saves time without drawing attention to themselves. What made the moment powerful wasn't the improvisation, it was what it represented. Instead of letting a small mistake become another reset, Robin absorbed it. He protected the rhythm of the set the same way he had protected the young extra earlier, not by confrontation, but by adaptation. That's when several crew members realized something they hadn't fully articulated before. Robin wasn't just performing for the camera. He was managing the emotional energy of the entire room. As the afternoon edged toward evening, the schedule finally began to recover. Shots that had seemed impossible earlier in the day started landing cleanly. Conversations between departments became lighter. Someone even laughed between setups. A real laugh, not the tired kind people force when they're exhausted. But the most significant change was quieter. People began speaking to each other differently. The assistant director gave instructions with more patience. A camera operator explained a mark more clearly instead of assuming everyone already understood. Even the extras, usually isolated in their own small cluster, were included in quick clarifications about timing. It was as if the earlier moment had reminded everyone that efficiency doesn't have to come at the cost of dignity. Near the end of the day, the production prepared for one final pass of the sequence, a complicated shot meant to tie together multiple angles captured earlier. Everyone knew it mattered. Ending the day with a clean take would save hours later. Positions were set. Silence settled. The young extra felt the familiar surge of nerves, but this time it was different. The fear wasn't about being thrown out. It was about wanting to contribute correctly. As the camera rolled, the movement flowed almost effortlessly, timing aligned. Background action felt natural. Dialogue landed with the kind of rhythm editors hope for. When the director called cut, he didn't immediately speak. He watched the playback for a few seconds longer than usual. Then he nodded. That's the one. Relief spread through the room like a wave finally breaking. Crew members exhaled. Shoulders dropped. Someone quietly joked about finally being able to sit down. It could have ended there, a normal wrap to a long day. But as people began resetting equipment, the director did something subtle that many almost missed. He walked across the set, not toward the stars or department heads, but toward the background tables. He paused near the young extra. No speech, no spotlight. Just a simple, professional acknowledgement that the timing had been right. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. But for someone who had nearly frozen under pressure hours earlier, it felt like validation that he hadn't imagined. Across the room, Robin watched the exchange. He didn't interrupt. He didn't claim credit. He simply adjusted his glasses, still half in costume, and offered a small, satisfied smile, the kind that comes when a situation resolves without needing recognition. As the crew prepared to wrap for the evening, conversations returned, lighter now, more human. People joked about the heat, about the long day, about needing real food instead of prop dishes. The young extra stayed seated for a moment longer than necessary, absorbing what had just happened. Not the mistake, that already felt distant, but the fact that the day hadn't ended in humiliation like he had feared. Instead, it had ended with something unexpected. Belonging. Across the stage, Robin finally stood, stretching carefully under the heavy costume. For a brief second, he looked less like a performer and more like someone simply relieved that the room had found its balance again. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do in a high-pressure environment isn't to dominate it. It's to steady it. And on that long, exhausting day, without speeches, without headlines, without any cameras capturing it, one person had quietly shifted an entire production from tension back to trust. Most people would never know it happened. But the people who were there would remember the feeling. The moment when the machine didn't stop working. It started working together. By the time the crew began packing down lights for the evening, most of the tension that had once gripped the set had dissolved into the familiar fatigue that follows a long production day. People moved slower now, voices softer, footsteps heavier. Equipment cases snapped shut one by one. The sharp urgency that had defined the afternoon was replaced by the quiet routine of wrap. For most, it was just another difficult day finally ending. For the young extra, it felt like surviving something much larger than a missed cue. He lingered near the edge of the restaurant set longer than necessary, unsure whether to leave immediately or wait for further instructions. Extras are rarely told much once filming ends. They fade back into the background the moment the camera stops rolling. Normally, he would have slipped out quietly with the others, blending into the small stream of people heading toward wardrobe returns and sign-out sheets. But that day, his legs didn't move. The earlier moment, the mistake, the pause, the unexpected kindness kept replaying in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. Embarrassment still lingered, but now it was tangled with something else. Confusion, maybe, or disbelief that someone of Robin Williams' stature had taken the time to notice him at all. Across the stage, makeup assistants began preparing removal supplies. The transformation that had taken hours would now be reversed piece by piece. Robin sat in the chair, still wearing the full costume, patiently waiting his turn while crew members finished securing equipment. From a distance, he looked smaller somehow, not physically, but energetically, as if the performance that had filled the room all day had finally been allowed to rest. The young extra considered leaving. That would have been the safer choice. Quiet, invisible, no risk of saying the wrong thing. But before he could decide, one of the production assistants approached him and said almost casually, he asked if you could hang back for a minute. The words landed heavier than expected. Not the director. Not wardrobe. Hey. The extra's throat tightened. He nodded, unsure what to expect, and waited near the edge of the set while the last of the crew filtered out. Minutes passed. The room grew quieter. Finally, Robin stood from the makeup chair, half of the prosthetics already removed. Without the full transformation, the contrast was striking. One side still carrying the familiar features of Mrs. Doubtfire, the other revealing the tired, human face underneath. He walked over slowly, not with the exaggerated energy audiences associated with him, but with the careful pace of someone whose body had endured a long day under heat and latex. Up close, the young extra noticed details he hadn't seen before. Faint redness where adhesive had pulled at the skin, small lines of fatigue around the eyes, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't show on camera. Robin stopped a few feet away and leaned casually against the back of a chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was intentional, like a pause before something important. Then Robin asked quietly, "You almost left earlier, didn't you?" The extra hesitated, surprised. I thought I was supposed to." Robin nodded, as if that answer confirmed something he already knew. Most people would have. There was no judgment in his voice, just understanding. He gestured toward the now empty set, the tables, the fake dishes, the carefully arranged lights. Without the crowd, it looked less like a bustling restaurant and more like what it really was, a constructed illusion waiting for the next day. "Places like this can feel big," Robin said, "especially when you're new, big enough to make you think one mistake defines you." The young extra swallowed, unsure how to respond. Robin continued, softer now, "It doesn't." He pulled out a nearby chair and sat, motioning for the extra to do the same. Sitting across from him, half in character, half out, felt surreal. The extra struggled to reconcile the legendary performer with the tired, sincere person in front of him. Robin leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "You know what nobody tells you when you start?" he asked. The extra shook his head. "That everyone here," Robin said, gesturing around the empty set, "is pretending they know exactly what they're doing." A faint smile appeared, not comedic but honest. "Even the people who have been here 20 years. The extra let out a small breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Robin's tone shifted, still warm but more serious now. Pressure does strange things to good people, makes them forget they were new once, makes them talk sharper than they mean to. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But that doesn't mean you don't belong." The sentence landed with unexpected weight. For someone who had spent the entire day trying not to be noticed, being told he belonged felt almost disorienting. Robin studied his reaction, not intrusively, but attentively, like someone making sure a message had actually reached its destination. "Listen," he added, "this industry can be loud, fast, impatient. If you let every harsh moment decide who you are, it'll eat you alive." Another pause. "But if you decide you're still learning, every single day, you'll last longer than most." The extra finally found his voice. "Why did you stop everything earlier?" Robin leaned back, exhaling slowly. For the first time, his expression carried something heavier than fatigue, something closer to memory. "Because," he said, "I remember being the person nobody noticed." The words were simple, but the weight behind them suggested they came from somewhere deep and personal. "I remember rooms where one wrong move meant people stopped listening," he continued. "And I remember how much it mattered when someone didn't let that happen." He didn't elaborate. He didn't turn it into a story about himself. He just let the statement sit there, quiet and real. The young extra realized then that the moment earlier hadn't been about heroics or authority. It had been about recognition, one person seeing another before the system labeled him disposable. Robin shifted tone again, lighter now, as if intentionally easing the emotional gravity. "Also," he added with a faint grin, "if we fired everyone who messed up today, I'd be the first one out." The humor broke the tension just enough for the extra to laugh, an awkward, relieved sound that felt like the first genuine breath he'd taken all day. Robin stood, stretching carefully. Without the full costume, he looked less like a larger-than-life performer and more like someone simply ready to go home. Before turning back toward the makeup area, he said one final thing. "Next time you're nervous," he said, "don't try to be perfect, just try to be present. The camera can tell the difference." Then he walked away, no dramatic exit, no lingering for gratitude. Just a quiet return to the routine of removing the rest of the transformation. The young extra remained seated for several seconds, absorbing what had just happened. The embarrassment from earlier hadn't vanished completely, but it had changed shape. It no longer felt like a permanent mark. It felt like something survivable. Around him, the last few crew members finished their tasks, unaware of the full conversation that had taken place. To them, it was just another wrap. But to the extra, the room felt different now. Smaller, less intimidating. As he finally stood to leave, he realized something subtle but powerful. He wasn't walking out as someone who had nearly been replaced. He was walking out as someone who had been seen. Across the stage, Robin glanced up briefly while a makeup artist worked on removing the final pieces. Their eyes met for a second. Robin gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not praise. Not approval. Just acknowledgement. It was enough. Because sometimes the most life-changing moments aren't loud or public. Sometimes they happen in nearly empty rooms, after the cameras stop rolling, when one person decides that another person's confidence is worth protecting. And long after the lights shut off that night, long after the set went dark, that quiet conversation would echo far beyond that soundstage, shaping decisions, building resilience, and planting a belief that might not show results for years. The production would continue. Scenes would be filmed. Schedules would move forward. But for one young performer, the story of that day was no longer about a mistake. It was about the moment someone powerful chose kindness over convenience, and in doing so, changed the direction of a life that had almost turned back toward the exit. Years have a way of softening the sharp edges of memory, but they also have a strange habit of preserving the moments that changed us without asking permission. Long after the restaurant set had been dismantled, long after the costumes were archived and the lights stored away in quiet warehouses, the echo of that one afternoon continued moving forward, quietly, steadily, through a life that might have turned out very differently. The young extra did what most background performers do after a job ends. He returned to smaller sets, smaller roles, smaller rooms where his name still wasn't on any call sheet anyone important read twice. The industry did not suddenly open its doors. There were no instant breakthroughs, no miraculous auditions that turned him into a star overnight. Hollywood rarely works that way, no matter how inspiring the stories sound later. Instead, progress came slowly, almost invisibly. Another background job, a tiny line in a low-budget project, a commercial where his face appeared for less than 2 seconds before the edit cut away. Weeks where the phone didn't ring at all. Months where he questioned whether he should find something more stable, something less uncertain. What changed wasn't his circumstances. It was his reaction to them. On difficult days, when auditions went nowhere, when casting directors barely looked up from their paperwork, his mind would return to that nearly empty set, to the moment someone with nothing to gain had taken time to remind him he belonged in the room. That memory didn't remove rejection, but it made rejection survivable. It turned each setback into something temporary instead of final. Confidence, he learned, is rarely loud. Most of the time it is just the quiet decision to show up again. As the years passed, he began to notice something else. The people who lasted the longest in the industry weren't always the most naturally talented. They were the ones who could endure the long stretches between opportunities without letting bitterness replace curiosity. They were the ones who kept learning, watching how experienced actors listened, how directors communicated, how crews solved problems under pressure. So he paid attention. He watched blocking patterns. He memorized how marks were placed and why. He studied how small adjustments in posture could change how a camera read a moment. He asked respectful questions when appropriate and stayed silent when it was. Little by little, he became someone directors trusted to do exactly what was needed. No more, no less. Years later, that trust turned into a single spoken line. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of moment that earns applause. But when the director called action, the camera moved slightly closer than it would have for an extra. The microphone captured his voice clearly. For the first time, he wasn't background, he was part of the scene. After the take, no one celebrated. The day moved forward like any other. But inside, something shifted. Not pride. Validation. The memory of that earlier day resurfaced, not as nostalgia, but as confirmation that the encouragement he had once received hadn't been misplaced. Time continued to move. More small roles followed. A recurring background position on a television show, a short exchange of dialogue in a supporting scene, nothing that would make headlines but enough to build a steady rhythm of work. He became, in industry terms, reliable. And reliability, though rarely glamorous, is one of the most respected currencies on a professional set. Then one afternoon, many years after that first overwhelming day, he found himself in a situation that felt strangely familiar. A new production, a crowded set, a young performer clearly struggling under the weight of expectation. The signs were obvious: tense shoulders, delayed reactions, eyes searching for approval after every cue. The room's energy began to tighten. Schedules were slipping. Voices sharpened. For a brief second, the older version of the once nervous extra felt the old fear return, not for himself, but for the person about to become the center of frustration. And in that moment, he recognized the crossroads. Say nothing, or do something small. He didn't interrupt the director. He didn't create a scene. Instead, during the next short reset, he simply walked over, introduced himself, and quietly said, "You're doing better than you think. Just breathe and hit the mark you practiced." The words were simple, almost identical to what he had once heard. The effect was immediate. The young performer's shoulders lowered slightly. The next take went smoother, not perfect, but natural enough that the scene moved forward. No one applauded. No one even noticed the exchange. But the cycle had continued. Kindness had repeated itself. That night, driving home, he realized something that settled deeper than any professional milestone. The moment that had once saved his confidence hadn't been meant to end with him. It had been a starting point, not a conclusion. Meanwhile, the world beyond film sets moved forward as well. Audiences continued discovering stories that made them laugh, cry, and remember why human connection matters. Among those stories were performances that carried the unmistakable warmth and spontaneity of Robin Williams, moments that reminded people that humor and compassion are not opposites, but partners. When news eventually spread, years later, that Robin Williams had passed away, the industry responded with public tributes, clips, speeches, shared memories of brilliance and generosity. Most focused on the laughter he gave the world, the unforgettable characters, the boundless energy. But for those who had witnessed quieter moments, the ones that never made it into interviews, the loss felt personal in a different way. Because they remembered the spaces between performances, the way he spoke to crew members by name, the way he stayed after wrap to thank people others overlooked, the way he treated nervous newcomers as if their presence mattered. On the evening of a small retrospective screening, the once young extra, now a working character actor, sat in the back of a modest theater as scenes from Mrs. Doubtfire played on the screen. Laughter filled the room at the familiar lines. The audience saw the polished final product, The timing, the jokes, the warmth. What they couldn't see were the invisible moments behind those scenes. The pauses, the quiet conversations, the decision to protect someone's confidence when it would have been easier to move on. As the credits rolled, the audience applauded, some for nostalgia, some for admiration, some simply because the story still made them feel something years later. The man in the back didn't clap immediately. Instead, he watched the names scroll past, the hundreds of people who had contributed to a film most viewers associated with only a few faces. He understood now what he hadn't known back then. Every production is built not just on talent, but on trust. Eventually, he joined the applause. Not just for the film, for the memory of a moment that had never been recorded. Outside the theater, conversations buzzed about favorite scenes, funniest lines, unforgettable performances. No one mentioned the quiet intervention that had once happened between takes on a hot soundstage. They couldn't. They hadn't been there. But that didn't make it less real. Because the true impact of kindness is rarely measured by how many people witness it. It's measured by how far it travels after the moment ends. Somewhere on another set, another nervous newcomer would receive a calm word instead of criticism. Somewhere else, a stressed director would choose patience instead of frustration. Small decisions, repeated over time, quietly reshaping environments that often forget how human they are. That is how influence really works, not through headlines but through echoes. In the end, the story was never about stopping a production or correcting a mistake. It was about something much simpler. A reminder that in places built on pressure and perfection, the most powerful act is sometimes to pause long enough to see the person standing in front of you. Long after the lights fade and the sets disappear, those pauses remain, carried forward in the way people treat each other when no one is watching. A star can command attention, but a person who chooses empathy, especially when it costs time, creates something far more lasting. Not a scene, a ripple. And somewhere in that ripple, a young extra once learned that being noticed for the right reason can change the direction of an entire life. While the person who made that choice walked away without asking for credit, satisfied simply knowing that, for one moment, the machine had remembered how to be human.